This is Talking Drupal, a bi-weekly chat about web design and development by a group of guys with at least one thing in common. We love the elections in the United States, and we love Drupal. Recorded live on Wednesday afternoons in a Drupal Hangout. Visit us at talkingdrupal.com. This is episode 132, Wednesday, November 9th, 2016, Drupal licensing. Good afternoon, gentlemen.
Good afternoon.
So who was up until 3 a.m. this morning to listen to Mr. Trump's acceptance speech?
I believe you mean President-elect Trump.
Yes, President-elect.
I was up until 3:30.
Yeah, so you went through it like I did.
So I was kind of the opposite. I went to bed at like 10 because they couldn't take it, and then I woke up in the middle of the night at about 3:30. And then stayed up the rest of the night.
Yeah. So you were the smart one.
I took the napping approach. I kind of got into bed at like 11 and turned on the TV, and then I fell asleep, and then I woke up, and then I fell asleep, and then I woke up, and then I was up for a little while, and so
the one thing I learned last night, outside of who became the next president of the U.S., is that I cannot sleep on the couch very often anymore because I have a terrible backache today. And that was me laying on the couch from like 9 p.m. till actually 7 this morning when I actually got off of it. So welcome, guys. That's the big news here in the U.S. on November 9th is the election. And this show is not about that, thank God. But it might be about something is equally stressing and boring and exciting all at the same time. We're going to be talking about Drupal licensing and the GPL today. And with us, as usual, is John Picozzi from Oomph.
Good afternoon. You, Stephen, I can see from your hat that you voted.
Yes, you know what? So this is the funny thing is that depending on who you voted for, you probably are wearing that sticker still or not.
No, that's not true. I actually... it was interesting to me that people are wearing these stickers as badges of honor, which I firmly believe in voting, and I firmly believe it's our civic duty to do so. But I think it's funny that everybody gets so excited to get a sticker.
Well, I think I haven't looked at these numbers yet, but I'm anticipating that the voter percentage has increased significantly this year.
Oh yeah,
Nick, this seems like something you would know.
Voter turnout's definitely a lot higher. They were doing some comparison last night on NBC, and in some areas it was almost hundreds of thousands of people higher, which is interesting and kind of crazy. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next 4 years when it's time to do it all over again. If that many people still come out and vote, or if they decide to stay home.
I mean, that's one great takeaway from the election is that people are passionate about, including Nick's dog. They're passionate about the election and getting out there and voting. That's the most important thing. So also with us today is Nick Laughlin from Enlighten Development.
Good
Nick,
afternoon.
did your dog vote?
He did not, but I did vote. I'm actually looking forward to today's topic. It's something that I've always been interested in, but never quite fully understood the intricacies. So I'm very happy to have an expert on the call so that I can hopefully get some of my questions answered. But looking forward to today's discussion.
And our expert today is Kevin. Kevin, I didn't even ask how to pronounce your last name properly. Is it Reinen?
It's Reinen.
Reinen. Okay, Kevin Reinen. Kevin is the lead software engineer for the University of Colorado Boulder. He's been doing development on open source since 2001, and he currently maintains many Drupal modules that are used by thousands of sites. I mean, if you take a look at his Drupal profile, which is KRYNEN, there's a very impressive list there. Him and I were discussing that before the call here, and I mean, when you look at someone's profile like that, all you can do is say thank you. So Kevin, officially, thank you. and he's with us today because he is the lead on the licensing. Is it the licensing working group? Is that how it's said?
Yeah, so the Drupal Association has a number of working groups. Most people are familiar with the security working group and the infrastructure working group and now the content working group. And the licensing working group tends to be a little lower profile. You only really interact with us if you have done something wrong or you're trying to figure out a way to do it right.
Or if something has sparked your interest in licensing, which it was for us, which was the WordPress in Wix. I'm not sure it's fair to say controversy, but discussion online over the past 2 weeks, which had us reach out to you.
Yeah, so licensing really isn't that exciting until there's a problem. So most people believe in the kindergarten version of writing code, people who are working in open source at least, that sharing is good, but the details of exactly how you share and how you legally require other people to share tends to be a little bit of a mystery for most folks.
So let's start with, what does the licensing working group do for Drupal? What is your main role and why are you here?
So Drupal's really always had a licensing working group. Just in the early years, it was a licensing group of one, which is Larry Garfield. He wrote the majority of Drupal's licensing policies with advice from the Free Software Foundation and the Drupal Association's legal counsel. But basically, it's an attempt to scale Larry since he can't do everything. So I was helping to manage the packaging whitelist for distributions, and there was a lot of confusion about the GPL 2+ policies that Drupal has, and what we would allow and what we wouldn't allow, why you could do some things once you downloaded the software, but we wouldn't allow that to be distributed from Drupal.org. So that project, while successful in getting a lot of distributions back to Drupal.org, was kind of a mess as far as licensing went. And I had a number of conversations with Holly Ross about who was supposed to be making these decisions, and it turned out that no one really knew, which is common in Drupal, that things had gotten done because people had volunteered time and those people had moved on to other projects. And so we had a group on groups.drupal.org for legal issues, where people would post questions and they would sit there for months unanswered, and it was really unclear whether silence was acceptance and they could just do what they had asked about, or whether somebody was going to eventually respond to them. So that's what was the motivation for forming the licensing working group and getting that charter approved by the Drupal Association. So no one on the group is a lawyer. I should make the I am not a lawyer disclaimer. So we always tell people that the advice we're giving is more about how to effectively share code than how to build a business around it. And if your goal is to make money off open source software, you should have your own legal representation to make sure that you're doing it right. And there isn't a whole lot of case law regarding GPL, so that's why this Wix WordPress conflict is so interesting, because if it were to go to court, it would establish some case law regarding some of the things that people have just accepted but never challenged in court regarding the GPL.
So Kevin, do you have, outside of, so you got involved with the licensing working group in the Holly Ross era. So have you been involved in licensing before that, or is it more of your passion with open source, or how did that happen?
Yeah, so I've always been interested in open source and sharing what I wrote even before getting involved in Drupal, and I almost quit Drupal over a licensing issue with the TinyMCE module. I wanted to include the LGPL licensed JavaScript into the module to make it easier to install. And this is back in the Drupal 4.7 days, and was told that due to limitations in CDS that there was just no way that we could have 150K worth of JavaScript including in a module, even though other projects like jQuery Update were already doing that. And so there was a lot of confusion about what the rules really were, what happened if you violated the rules. Moxie Code, the group that wrote TinyMC, suggested that instead of including 150K of JavaScript, which some people in the infrastructure group thought would be too big, that they were concerned about disk space as far as keeping copies of all these third-party libraries. Yeah, it seems funny now, but
it does.
So they offered a 10K like get started version of the TinyMC editor that people could then upgrade. So at least when you installed the module, you would have a decent user experience. And everyone who's used Drupal has seen these multi-step install processes where you install a module and then it tells you to go to this specific URL that may or may not still be there and download this library, rename the directory that was downloaded, place it in your site's all libraries. And so there's licensing aspects to how to do that well that Drupal has really avoided with a strict everything that you commit to Drupal's repos has to be licensed as GPL2. We allow GPL2 or 3 with the use of Drupal, but everything that we're checking in to Drupal's Git repos has to be compatible with GPL2.
So,
go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to say, how does that actually work? Because I know that, for example, in the root directory of Drupal, when you download it, it has the GPL2 license. But if I put up a module, not every module has the license explicitly in it.
Not only that, but as we shift to Composer, the Composer manifest record includes the GPL2 plus designation, which Composer considers to be a deprecated license definition. And it's pulling that information from Git in a lot of cases, which we only add the licensed text file when the snapshot is packaged or a release is packaged. Mm-hmm. Packaging scripts add that license. So in our Git repo, we do not have the license file included with the code, which is technically not the way code should be distributed as well. So there's a lot of issues related to how we're currently doing licensing. But that being said, the keep everything GPL2 policies served us really well instead of going the direction that a lot of other projects went, which created some really complicated policies that were even harder for people to understand. So we've been really strict and limiting in what we've allowed to be distributed from Drupal.org versus what people can distribute off of Drupal.org. And that's created a lot of confusion, but it's helped us avoid some of the licensing issues that WordPress has run into.
So before we get into some of these details, for the listeners that are not familiar with what GPL is, General Public License, let's do a quick overview of the basics of GPL and what the goals are for that license.
So again, this goes back to, everyone believes that sharing is good. And when we started using GPL and Drupal, that was the standard. Since then, licensing has gotten a lot more complicated with licenses that are specific to different types of content. But the goal is really what a lot of people refer to as the 4 essential freedoms. The freedom to run a program anywhere you want for whatever purpose you want. So no one can say that if Donald Trump wants to use my Drupal module on the new whitehouse.gov site, he can't because I'm not going to allow that. When you license something as GPL, you're giving people that you like the right to use it, but you're also giving people that are going to do things that you don't like with your code. There's no do no evil clause in the GPL. And then
there are multiple licenses out there that are trying to address the same goal, right?
As far as goals of the GPL or goals of not allowing evil.
Yeah, so like the MIT license, for example.
Right. Right. Yeah, there are a number of licenses that are even more lax than the GPL. But the other parts of the GPL, the 4 freedoms, are the right to study how the program works. The fact that if you license something under GPL, and we saw this a lot with Flash, where people were only distributing the compiled Swifts, and we needed the actual raw FLAs with that. Now Flash has kind of gone out of style, but we have that same issue with anything that gets compiled, that you have to distribute the source version of things so that I can see how it was actually put together. And then the right to distribute copies freely. So if you're licensing something under the GPL and you sell it to me, I have the right to then just give it away. And that's like one of the fundamental misunderstandings of people who are trying to sell Drupal and WordPress projects, is that some of what they're selling, the only reason people aren't turning around and giving it away for free is because they want to either support that ecosystem or they don't understand the licensing. And then the other freedom, but not a requirement, is the freedom to distribute copies of modified versions. So you can't say that this is the only version of CCK that would ever be allowed, and no one else is allowed to create a fork of it or name it something similar and create that type of confusion. That doesn't exist in the GPL. The right to fork is one of the fundamental rights. So there are other licenses that provide these same type of freedoms, but do it in different ways and have different requirements. And the Free Software Foundation does a really good job of documenting license compatibility. So you can look on their site and see which versions of the GPL MIT is compatible with versus the Apache 2 license. But you guys have some questions about licensing versus copyright. It's even more confusing because there's also trademark and patent in there as well. And how things get used can depend on what is most beneficial for the person, what goal they're trying to achieve with whether something is copywritten or whether the only limitation is giving attribution to the original copyright holder.
So could you describe that in a little bit of detail here? And I know you're not a lawyer again, but what is the difference between someone having a copyright to something and a license to it?
So copyright, and again, there's not a whole lot of case law regarding this. Yep. So with a copywritten work with something like a book, it's the content of the book that is the thing that's copywritten. And with code, it's more difficult to copyright the actual programming language, the procedural code or object-oriented code. That there are people that have tried to make that claim, but that has not held up well. So usually when you see a copyright notice, it's a copyright of the things that go along with the code, and the code itself will have a different license.
So can I copyright the module that I create for Drupal?
So you can copyright, so you can claim copyright of it, but usually all that copyright requires is someone attribute, if it's also GPL licensed, they can modify your original work. And so you're claiming that you wrote the original thing, that's your work. And if anyone's going to use it, they need to attribute you as the source of the original work. So you can't copyright it and then go around and sue someone for using the code under copyright infringement. That would be very unlikely to hold up.
So,
right, because it's also being GPL.
So probably the number one question that I have around the GPL, and every time I think about it or talk about it, is the clause about distribution. So if you distribute the product, you need to distribute the source code, and where does that line lie?
Right. So
and what does distribute mean, by the way, too?
So most people believe that the developer delivering code that they were hired to do as a work-for-hire contract does not constitute distribution. So that's usually the biggest question. That I wrote something for a client, I'd like to distribute it everywhere. They're telling me that they own that code, but it should be GPL. Do I have a right to distribute it? And the answer is normally no, but we also recommend that you talk to a lawyer if you really wanted to do that. So some of that depends on where the code came from, because if the code that you gave a client what came from Drupal.org, then it was already licensed under GPL2, and you are free to distribute that, because even though you've been hired as a work-for-hire contract, they cannot further restrict your rights under the GPL to freely distribute your modified version of that work. Does that make sense in that use case?
Yeah. So the question, I guess the specific question is, if a client hires me to build a website for them, they just say, hey, I need a website that has 4 pages in this tiny little module, and I host it on my own servers. Do I need to give them the source code to that website?
So that gets into more of the software as a service model. If you didn't deliver the code to them, if you were hired in the definition of the contract doesn't specify that you have to deliver the source, just that you have to host the website, then usually no, you don't have to deliver that. And you certainly can't force someone who's created a modified version of a GPL project, even Drupal core, who's hosting that as a service, to share their version of that. Where Wix got into trouble is that they were distributing the mobile app with GPL licensed code via the iTunes Store, via the Google Play Store. So the distribution clause kicks in that case, versus if that was just part of the Wix service, then only something like a GPL would require them to release the modifications to and further distribute that.
So
Okay.
Kevin, to clarify, in Nick's question, that he's hired to develop a website and host it. He never gives code to the customer.
Right.
So the customer doesn't have any rights in terms of using that code or distributing it to anyone else.
Yeah, their only rights would be defined in the contract that they gave Nick when they hired him.
Right.
Now, depending on the state you're in, there could be a lot of like implied consent and things like that, and that's where you would depending on where the client was, where you're working, what legal entity the contract was defined to arbitrate under. All of those things are going to come into play. But typically if you're doing software as a service and you write code for someone, regardless of its origin, that doesn't trigger the distribution clause.
Okay.
So what exactly does trigger the distribution clause?
Well, if I go to one of these commercial module resellers and I buy a module, I can freely distribute that. And I've joked about creating a Kickstarter fund to buy all of the commercial WordPress modules and release their PHP source on GitHub before, because I don't understand why that ecosystem continues to exist that way. You can put copyright restrictions on the use of images and even potentially some CSS and JavaScript within what you distribute.
Files, yeah.
The PHP code that they're distributing for sale with kind of some of these ridiculous end user license agreements saying that you can't distribute those, that is a clear violation of the GPL and something that WordPress has never addressed. They actually reference, if you look at WordPress's licensing document on WordPress.com or WordPress.org, it references Drupal's frequently asked questions for licensing. It is very clear about every module you create, if you distribute it, it's considered a derivative work of the CMS itself, at least the PHP is, and that has to be, if it's going to be distributed, it has to be distributed with a GPL license.
So I have one more distribution question, I think would clarify most of my questions around this. So if I have what if I have a client that hires me to write a software as a service for them? They don't ever ask for the source code, but their product requires that their customers have the source code running on their machine. So then their customers would then have that code distributed and would have the rights of the GPL, correct? So if I create a distribution and deploy it on their own, as long as it's not on my servers and it's on a client server, that's considered distribution? Or
So are you talking about JavaScript that would be executed within the browser of the client?
No,
no. An actual app that is distributed, given to the client.
So the client has me develop a Drupal distribution that will then run on a server that I don't maintain or manage.
As far as I know, there is no case law about this, and this is where it gets to be very confusing, because your contract would potentially cover you, and then if the client is installing something on multiple servers that they don't control, they're not just hosting it as a software as service, and people are buying that software and getting it in a download or on a CD or however it was distributed. most people would believe that that triggered the GPL requirement. But again, there's two different approaches to this. There's the approach that someone doesn't want to share the work that they've built on a GPL foundation, and then there's people that do want to share it and want to keep that protected. And so the licensing working group is really focused on the people that want to share their work and make sure that modifications to it are also shared.
Okay, that makes sense. And I think that to be honest, as a user of Drupal, I think that I'm very glad that that's the focus of the licensing working group, about keeping things open. And to be fair, I generally don't have a problem with sharing stuff. It's just the distribution clause has always been the biggest confusion point for myself, and I assume my clients. Although, to be honest, most of my clients don't really care as long as they have a working website.
Yeah, as long as the website's running, they're not concerned with this.
Yeah.
Right. The only time clients tend to be concerned about the GPL is when it's an enterprise level client that went to a conference or read somewhere that they should avoid GPL at all costs, that it's an infectious license and it'll destroy their business, that type of thing. And these, cases like Wix definitely don't help that image. There are a lot of enterprise clients that are enterprise users of Drupal that understand the GPL and have essentially firewalled it off from the rest of their proprietary systems so that there's no chance of having to distribute everything they do. They use APIs to integrate with, which 10 years ago was kind of unheard of, to have these clear delineations between the CMS and the thing the CMS would try to integrate with. Now it's just the default way that everything's done. But you don't intermingle the PHP of two different projects. You develop a API for the secondary thing that can exist on its own, and you use a GPL tool to interact via the API, which does not trigger the distribution.
So,
Kevin, can I sell Drupal or a Drupal module or a theme?
You can. One of the projects I worked on was integrating a JavaScript library called Isotope, and that's a product created by a group called Metaphysics. And they claim that the software has a GPL2 license for EDU use and non-commercial use, but requires a commercial license for anything else. And I pointed out to the developer of that project that really wasn't legal, that he can't really charge some people and not charge other people. And his response was that he knew that. And it was basically a tax on licensing ignorance, that these commercial clients were just going to pay the license rather than try to figure out what their rights actually were. And he had no intention of going around and suing everyone that was using it freely, especially people that were embedding it in an open source project. So you can definitely make money selling GPL code. The question is, if somebody undercuts you by freely distributing what your work was, or removes crippleware, you've done something that requires a callback to an API before the module would function. People that have attempted that in the past, it's pretty trivial for someone to go in there and remove that code so that the application will function. And there's a lot of people in the open source community that would do that just on principle, even if they didn't care about what the product was. So
I'm free as a developer to sell a module or a theme.
Right.
As long as I have the understanding that when I sell it to someone, they're free to distribute it.
You can sell the code and make that clear to the user. You can obfuscate that. You can charge for support for that. You can charge for customizations. The idea is that the actual work isn't getting locked up into a license that doesn't allow the software to continue to evolve and be improved by other contributions.
So along that same line, my approach has always been with Drupal and Drupal modules is that, clients are essentially paying me or paying the company I work for our expertise to set up Drupal, to implement Drupal. Ultimately, at the end of the day, if they want the code, they want, all the modules that we used, we're going to give that to them. In most cases, it's on a server that they own. They have access to it, so on and so forth. is that, is that thinking, the thinking that I'm not necessarily selling Drupal or selling modules, but I'm selling the service of me configuring that? Is that thinking necessarily wrong, or is that in some violation of the GPL?
No, everyone, I shouldn't say everyone, I guess some people are just complete anarchists and don't want to make a living, but most people working in Drupal are trying to make a living doing this. And so having limits on your ability to charge for your services and expertise, would just kill the project outright. So it's not so much that what you deliver to that client, you can't charge for that. It's that the software needs to be allowed to live and change and be modified. And nothing that any of us do within the project should ever be able to stop anyone else from taking the project in a different direction, building things and how they want, and freely distributing those and continuing the project in other ways.
So I have a question that's a little bit different. That kind of goes back a little bit towards the licensed working group. How closely do you work with other projects? And when I say other projects, I mean both projects of the scale of like WordPress and projects that are like individual libraries, and try to work out these intricacies.
Yeah, so Font Awesome and the Bootstrap projects are the two that we've probably interacted with the most as far as how they did licensing. Font Awesome for a long time was claiming that they were GPL compatible, even though the Free Software Foundation considered the open font license to not be compatible for one very specific reason, which is that you can't just distribute the font. You have to distribute the font as it's used some way. And the reason font developers, font creators wanted that included in the license, they didn't want someone collecting a bunch of open source fonts and offering it on a font CD, which used to be a thing. So that got built into that license. And Creative Commons licenses have some clauses that are specific to content that earlier versions of Creative Commons share alike license make them incompatible with the GPL. If you were trying to license code with these different licenses. When you download Font Awesome, you're getting a number of different licenses, and they've really improved the way they describe that. If you look on their GitHub project, there's a very long thread about the licensing terminology they're using. And so I believe what they're still using is it's a GPL-friendly project. So the open font license can be included with any open source work, including the GPL. In large part because the font itself is not is considered an asset, not code. So it really doesn't have to adhere to the GPL from the GPL's perspective. It only has to be GPL from Drupal's perspective. And this is one of the things that the licensing group is trying to change. We recognize that in the last 10 years, licensing has evolved, and there are licenses that are better fits for content and fonts that aren't strictly GPL. And so our suggestion to the Drupal Association is to allow other license types for assets that continue to allow the four freedoms that don't conflict with what we can do with GPL. So anyone that took Font Awesome and wanted to add their own custom logo into that library could. Carl Wiggins, I'm not sure I have his first name right, but from NBC Universal, he made a 2-year Don Quixote attack against windmills to get the Bootstrap project to change their licensing to MIT. And that was a huge undertaking because it required reaching out to all previous contributors and trying to develop some sort of consensus to change the license. And so that's one of the brilliant things that Larry Garfield and the people that established Drupal's licensing early on had the foresight to do, is the and later clause that is considered part of the Git, or previously the CVS access policy that everyone agrees to. So Drupal can, if they wanted to, distribute Drupal as GPL3. So because we all agreed to that or GPL4 if that ever came to be, because when we uploaded our code to Drupal.org, we agreed to that up front. So we do interact with a lot of projects through through the packaging whitelist, projects, libraries that people want to include in a distribution. We have to go out, look at the licensing that's in GitHub, figure out whether the license is actually accurate, whether the user that applied the license actually had the right to do that. And so we'll help people clean up their licensing so that a project can be included in a Drupal distribution as well.
So I actually have a combination question of my last question and Nick's question. So again, going from the standpoint of, most of the people that use Drupal, doing client work, quote unquote, distributing this to clients and their servers. Say that there's a piece of software, and maybe it's a proprietary piece of software, not under the GPL, that I need to integrate into Drupal some way. Not necessarily building a Drupal module, but I need to integrate it. This needs to be part of kind of the package that gets delivered to the client server, right? Is that in violation of the GPL, or is it because we're not distributing it?
It's because you're not distributing as a single package. And you see this all the time. So CiviCRM is a very popular AGPL3 project. It is, in fact, something that the Drupal Association has used for a long time. So it's totally within your rights with the project with licenses GPL2 or later to download that project and then combine it yourself with licenses that wouldn't be compatible with GPL2. So what we've tried to do within the licensing working group and the Drupal Association, the Drupal community, is say, if you're getting code from Drupal.org, regardless of whether it's a package distribution that pulls in code from a lot of external sources, or it was all committed to Drupal Get, it is going to be compatible with GPL2. And some of that compatibility comes from lax licenses, like the MIT license. And the reason why we include jQuery and the work that went along with changing some of the licensing requirements of CK Editor so that could be included and distributed with Core as well are what allows that. But if you want to use something that's Apache 2, like the AMP project, which is a really popular project from Lullabot that integrates Google's AMP library, Google prefers to use the Apache 2 software license that potentially includes some patent protection. It's unclear how much protection it actually provides. But we can't distribute that library with the module and still consider the module to be the PHP code to be GPL2, but you're well within your rights to download that module, download the Apache 2 library, and combine the two in your own solution. And you can even put that whole combined solution up on GitHub and distribute that fork of Drupal as GPL3. So that's totally within your rights.
So is it fair to say, as I'm listening to the conversation here, is it fair to say that, obviously everybody should be aware of the GPL license, but if you're not actually distributing Drupal and modules, your interaction with the GPL and possibly violating it could be far less than somebody that's, potentially reselling a module or trying to resell Drupal in some sort of way?
Yeah, I think the thing to take away is a lot like the work that the security working group is doing, that if your goal is to write code and share it with others and build on code that others have written, the licensing working group is here to protect your rights to do that. If you're getting into an area where you want to develop a business that's using GPL code and you want to know how you can offer it as a software service and not share it, then you need to be hiring your own attorney and figure those things out. So for most people in the Drupal community, that's not where they're trying to make money. They're trying to write code and distribute the code to clients or distribute it and as something that they sell as a service. And that is really what the licensing work is trying to protect.
Hey, Kevin, one thing that's not clear to me, and this comes back to I think one of my first questions, and relates to what John just asked. If a customer hires me to build the website for them and I'm posting that website to a hosting service that they have or that they're paying for, that's considered distribution, is it not?
It depends. It really, this is again, there's no, as far as I know, there is no case law that says that would trigger the distribution clause.
So tell me, when am I distributing things?
So if you have a website and you offer a download link that people get to after they enter a credit card, so you're providing a module. And if you look at the GPL, like frequently asked questions, there's actually clauses in there about whether or not you can charge for the mailing cost if you distribute the code on CD, how long a valid physical mailing address would have to exist for someone to send you a postcard and request the code, those types of things. So a lot of this has changed over the years, but it hasn't been challenged in court. So usually the interpretation is that if you were hired and your contract is a work for hire, and turning over the code to the person that hired you, regardless of whether you're giving them a copy of the code, you're checking it into a repo, you're putting it directly on the server, that does not invoke the distribution. But if you are selling the thing over and over again to individual clients, then that would be considered distribution.
Well, to be clear, if you weren't selling it.
All right, hang on. I'm going to trump you all here. I'm going to ask another question, follow-up question. Sorry, John.
Is that a pun? Were you just punning?
Yes, I am punning. So as you can tell, Kevin, we're excited about this. But I printed and read GPL version 2 and version 3, and there's a distinct difference to me in them. Well, one is 3 times bigger than the other, but other than that, the word distribution in GPL in version 2 is changed to convey in version 3. And I feel like when I sell something, or when I say sells, I build a website for someone, I'm conveying that I'm giving them license for that, which is not the same as distribution, which means I copied something to a disk and I mailed it to them or something like that. I feel like I'm conveying a license to them for that.
So the specific language change, the Free Software Foundation covers that in the FAQ, and the reason was because specific jurisdictions use distribution in relation to copyright differently, and so they changed the language to convey. But the meaning, as far as most American English speakers are concerned, really remain the same. They didn't intend to change the meaning of that. So if you compare that to the process that the Creative Commons uses, because they actually port their licenses to different languages and jurisdictions, that's a much more involved process. But their goal is to have lawyers vet the long-form language of the contract so that it would actually hold up in a court of law. And the GPL's approach has always been to have a single English version of the license that would, in theory, hold up in all these different jurisdictions. So the GPL made that change specifically to address how it was being used in other countries. The only other major change with GPL3 is that it opens the door to the AGPL requirement for software as service distribution, which is considered the SaaS loophole. So when GPL2 was written, that SaaS really didn't exist. This idea that all Drupal sites would be hosted on a single host and someone could modify the code in the background and would never trigger the distribution clause. And so the GPL3 itself does not close that loophole. You can still license something as GPL3, but it makes it compatible with AGPL. And these are like really passionate discussions that if you go back and read the email threads about, like, some people really wanted the GPL to close that loophole in the actual license, and then other people that had built businesses around software as a service really, really did not want that closed. And so the AGPL being a separate license was the compromise. So GPL3 and AGPL3 are compatible. AGPL is not compatible with a strictly GPL2 only licensed project.
So I suspect the answer is no to this question, but I just wanted to clarify. Does licensing have anything to do with kind of the discussion in Drupal around changing how modules are managed and patched, and whether we should move to GitHub or Composer, Packagist, or et cetera?
So the move to GitHub gets to be a little more confusing. If you've been following, GitHub has made huge strides to improve the visibility of licensing within their project. When you start a project now, you're presented with 3 licensing options. Unfortunately, they are MIT if you want to share your code freely, Apache 2 if you're concerned about patents, and GPL 3 if you want to have the viral aspect of it. You can pick all kinds of other licenses, and they use a Rails project to try to read the licensing TXT file now that is included in your project and show an icon displaying the license. But that type of automation, like if you look at the Font Awesome project, it's only finding one of the licenses. So you get kind of a false sense of security there as far as what is in the project. And so with GitHub, there's a number of projects that have a contributor license agreement that you have to sign before you are able to fork and do a pull request that they'll even consider. So you're free to fork it, but if you make a pull request and you haven't signed the CLA, they will not consider that pull request. And the Berkman Foundation, run out of Harvard, I believe, has recently took over that project, the CLA Hub project, which is the most popular version of those, to automate and protect that process. So for Drupal to move contrib development to GitHub and enforce our licensing, we would have to have that same type of what we call the Git user agreement now that you sign. We'd have to have you sign something that allowed the Drupal Association to have some control over how things are licensed if we wanted to do that. Now, the really interesting thing that's happening right now is with distributions, because distributions started with just being able to put a make file on Drupal.org. Then the 2.0 version of that allowed the packaging of that make file. Then the next version of it included a whitelist using regular expressions to check external assets to make sure they were compatible with Drupal's licensing, so that it would be what you're distributing from Drupal would be GPL 2. Now the plan for Drupal 8 is to have distributions live outside of Drupal.org, use their own automated testing workflows on GitHub or Bitbucket or wherever they're already being built, and have Drupal run their Composer file to actually pull in all these external assets. And the Composer has a licensing element in it, but it also has the concept of and versus or in those licenses. So what we currently distribute in the custom Drupal endpoint has a GPL 2 plus license on it, which if you look at Composer's documentation, that is considered a deprecated license. And what they really want is us to distribute everything as GPL 2 or GPL 3. And then when you run an automated check to see whether your licenses are compatible in that Composer build, scanning down into all of the child Composer files, you would be able to programmatically determine whether or not what you were distributing could be GPL 2, had to be GPL 3, was a completely incompatible license combination.
Kevin, would you expect that to cause significant troubles in modules that we already have in Drupal?
Well, the number one request for something people want to include in a distribution has been Font Awesome. I mean, it's just so common to build user interfaces using that font library, and we haven't allowed it. The Font Awesome project includes a CDN option so that it works out of the box. But in order to get that additional library into your actual Drupal build so it's used locally, you have to use drushmake or Composer or manually add the file to the correct location. So people have been working around these limitations for a while, which kind of defeats the purpose of them.
But Kevin, are they working around them because of licensing issues that they're concerned about?
Not because of GPL, because Drupal's attempt to keep licensing clean and clear, and there'd be a difference between what you get from Drupal.org and what you get off of Drupal.org. So if you get something from GitHub, not only is the licensing, this is the same with security. If you're getting modules from some other source, the method for security updates, the type of reviews that get, those are all a mystery. And it's up to you as the consumer to take on that additional responsibility. Whereas if you're downloading things from Drupal.org or using DrushDL to get them onto your system, you're using the community vetted process. And it's not to say that there's not going to be licensing or security issues, but we have people and processes in place to deal with that when everything lives on Drupal.org.
So I think a lot of us are familiar with the security route to have things checked out. How does that work for a licensing group? Like when a module is, I think we're all familiar with, if there's a Drupal module and it's past the development process, that we know the security team is looking at it. Is that the same for the licensing group?
So kind of. So project application review process where people are writing their first Drupal module that they want to publish. We don't scan all code that has been uploaded, committed to Git. We rely on users to report potential issues and then work through those issues. But if you have a blatant license violation in your code, if you're distributing an Apache 2 library with your GPL 2 module, we will unpublish that project just like the security working group would unpublish it for a security issue. So it's not that we're being proactive and scanning everything. We're a reactive group, and in part because we have so few people that are this familiar with licensing. And if you are, excited about licensing and take issue with any point I've made, you're more than welcome to join the group. We have heated discussions about a lot of these things.
How would someone do that, Kevin?
You can contact me directly via Drupal.org. You can post to the groups.drupal.org legal group or in the licensing working group issue queue or Twitter. Any of those, I will follow up with you. And we currently only have 3 members now, which can create a lot of work to review the licensing of these projects. We have more people working on the distribution packaging whitelist than we do in the actual licensing working group, in part because that's an actual task that people can wrap their head around instead of some of these philosophical arguments that have no case law to back up your opinions.
I will also say...
Go ahead, John. Sorry.
Sorry. No, that's all right. I was just going to say, to that note, the community is also really good about pointing out these issues as well. There was an instance with a module that I was working on where I was inadvertently distributing the logo of a service that I was using. And somebody was like,
Shame on you, John.
Pretty sure. Yeah, well, it wasn't without their permission, but the person pointed out that, it was in violation. So we obviously made the change and got the logo from somewhere else as opposed to distributing it out. But my point is that the community is really looking out as well. And, obviously it's up to module developers to kind of respect that and to kind of go with it.
Yeah, so the software licensing is one thing we deal with. The other licensing and trademark issues also end up in our queue often. So we've proposed some changes to Drupal's licensing policy that really like more feedback on. We proposed those during the Drupal Association reorg, and these are things that would allow things like Font Awesome, things that adhere to the 4 freedoms to be included in GitHub, since they are, what we really don't want is a 2-tier system of Drupal where people that are using Composer and Drush Make to create builds have access to all kinds of libraries and files, but people that are relying on getting the code from Drupal.org, who are going to download a module and then re-upload it, are going to have an inferior experience because of the licensing policies. So we're trying to find this middle ground where we can allow things that have kind of evolved. And the use case, an example that I always use to illustrate how strict and angry old menish our licensing policies are, or we license our documentation as Creative Commons Share-alike version 2, which is technically not compatible with the GPL. So literally, you could not take a paragraph from a node of documentation and copy that into the help portion of your module and not be in violation of Drupal's licensing policy. Obviously, that's crazy, so we don't enforce that. And the new user guide project is all being checked into Drupal.org Git policy and requested an exception to use a Creative Commons license within Drupal's Git, and that got approved by the Drupal Association because it made sense logically. So we're trying to propose changes to the strict GPL2 or get off my lawn policies because this is also just an appearance thing. Most new software developers that are fresh out of college are just going to go onto GitHub. They're going to create a project. They're more familiar with what they consider to be modern licenses and don't understand why a project would stick with such an old license and have such strict policies that don't allow you to combine all of the different free software licenses that you want to create the really awesome thing you're trying to do.
Hey, Kevin, as we start to wrap up, as we're at our 2 o'clock stop here, I wanted to get your input on the primary reason we initially reached out to you was the online, I would say, conversation between WordPress and Wix. So
that's polite.
Yeah, it was an online. I'm going to call it an online. Thank you.
I'd be more inclined to use the word kerfuffle, but hey, whatever.
Okay. So if you could give us a quick summary and maybe your thoughts on it would be great.
Yeah. So the quick summary is the founder of the WordPress project saw some code that the WordPress core team had contributed to, if not wrote the majority of, used in another project and distributed incorrectly. And as far as I've been able to tell, called them out publicly before giving them a chance to correct the mistake. And so that created a lot of back and forth about who was interpreting the GPL correctly. The problem with Matt's approach was that WordPress, as far as licensing, kind of lives in a glass house. That specific project he was referring to was originally licensed as MIT. And then after the project was started, they changed the license to GPL2. In addition, WordPress core included other projects that were incorrectly licensed and unattributed. So the fact that Matt called out Wix on this specific instance has generated a lot of scrutiny to WordPress, the way WordPress handles licensing. And when I do presentations about licensing, I always, two things to try to make licensing more interesting, which I encourage people to look up the WFPL license. I don't know what the PG rating on this podcast is, but that's a license.
It's clean till now, maybe.
That's a license that that is similar to MIT in actual legal requirements, but is a way that a lot of developers are saying, I want to give my code away and I don't care what you do with it, and I'm sick of trying to figure out what the right license is. So that's definitely, you'll see more of that. And we approve, there's several Drupal projects that have WTFPL licensed code in their project. That's the Free Software Foundation considers that to be a GPL compatible license.
Okay.
And the other thing is that give me 10 WordPress plugins and I can almost guarantee you I will find a GPL2 license violation. Just 10 random projects from WordPress. They're just so laxed with what they distribute and what they claim as far as
is there a difference licensing. So Kevin, is there a difference between WordPress.com and WordPress.org in terms of those license issues?
Contrib is definitely just a Wild West. I mean, you will get things that are Apache 2 that are GPL3. I've even found projects that include... And
Matt, the CEO there, can't control those.
He can, in that they control the index of projects.
Okay.
So they don't have a licensing working group that's vetting these to say, yes, that adheres with our interpretation of the GPL. You can go ahead and include a font. So I found fonts on there that say if you use it more than 10,000 impressions, then you have to start paying us. And that just scares the crap out of me, that someone would use that on a website for a client, not realizing that clause was in there. The creator of the font is just scanning the internet looking for people that are using this font, and then is going to send a bill to your client saying they owe this amount. So that's the type of thing that, we don't want happening from things you download from Drupal.org, and something that is just prevalent on WordPress. So that is a huge difference.
So would you think that the appropriate interpretation of WordPress would be that if I'm a WordPress user, that if I purchase a plugin related to WordPress, that I should be free to distribute that?
I say it's up to you to vet the license yourself.
Okay.
And figure out what exactly you downloaded and hope that they actually included the licensing terms with the download. We've seen that as well, that people have taken other open source projects, only included a few files of it, but then stripped the license out. So you really don't know what you got. So those are the types of problems that the strict GPL2 policies have allowed us to avoid. But I think WordPress as an organization has been providing a TSA level, licensing advice where there's the appearance of licensing, but the reality is what you download is just all over the place, and buyer beware.
So I guess
the
the underlying theme here is that if you really care about licensing and you want to make sure it's being done right, you should use Drupal.
You should use Drupal or thoroughly vet the code you're installing. I think WordPress core is better vetted or as well vetted as Drupal core, but their WordPress contrib, and you see this because WordPress has a much bigger commercial ecosystem for selling plugins and themes than Drupal does. And part of it is that people are doing all kinds of crazy things with licensing that the Drupal community has never embraced.
Hey, thank you, Kevin, for your time today.
Thanks a lot, guys.
If someone was interested in reaching out to you to get either involved in the licensing group or ask some specific questions for you,
or get tips on how to grow a stellar beard.
Yes, I was gonna mention that. Thank you, John.
There are a lot of stellar beards in Drupal.
That's true. So where could people reach out to you?
Just K Reinen at Twitter, or use my Drupal.org contact form. Are the best ways to reach me.
All right, great. How about you, John?
You can find me on all the major social networks at John Picozzi, and always on at umthink.com.
Awesome. How about you, Nick?
You can find me online pretty much everywhere at Nixvan, NICXVAN.
And for me, I'm on Twitter at Stephen Cross with PH. I also want to remind everyone, we haven't said this today, but we have a new Talking Drupal newsletter. Go to talkingdrupal.com and sign up for our newsletter. You get additional bonus content, and we can talk to you through your email for things that we have going on. And hey, thanks for everyone for contributing this week, and talk to you soon.
Thanks, guys.